I took the charge that James gave us seriously, which is to reflect a little bit on what we've heard, and I want to use that as a starting point to get into the conversation about the sort of more social dimensions. Of course, this is not the first time you hear about them, but it doesn't matter. I'll just try to synthesize some ideas. And I do this not sort of in the role of co-chair here, but as provocation. Everything here, everybody. I'm sure at the end of this, I will have made many people unhappy. So what I started to do last night is to think about what am I hearing about how we're all using the term resilience. And, first we were really friendly with each other, and we sort of, put our stickies up, and it all coexisted. And then we went into debate and actually said, no, it's this, no, it's that, no, you have to agree to my, it's an outcome, whatever. So I just thought, well, let's look at them around a number of different dimensions and see if they aren't really truly complementary. One version that we hear is thinking of resilience as a system trait or a condition. In that, the system as a whole and its particular traits is the focus. What we care about is whether it's functioning or not. What we ask about is what makes it resilient, and we look for these leverage points. I think Craig this morning made a good point on that one. And in terms of locating our values, it's sort of a priori neutral, right? We are not or agnostic about outcome. We're just describing the system as it works. In the second version that I've heard, it's the insistence on resilience is a process or a set of processes. And so what we're, oops, sorry, this is the wrong computer. Okay, let's do this again. In the second version, it's resilience as a process where our focus is really on actions or decisions. Igor made that point many times that we need to think about this in a sort of a decision framework. What we're interested in is system functionality and performance. For example, is my flood system still going to work under climate change, right? Very specific system in mind, and is that still working? What can we do to reduce impacts or losses or speed up recovery is really what we care about or ask about. And what we search for are decision support tools and actions that help to plan, prepare, absorb, recover, adapt. That's sort of the categorization of issues that we saw again and again in people focusing on the process definition. It's highly normative around what best practices are, right? It is, and because it's assumed that they lead to desirable outcomes. But that's really where the emphasis is. In the third variety, we heard resilience is an outcome. That's really all we care about. Interestingly, in this instance, I think no one has said this explicitly, but I think the emphasis here is on the actor. The people for whom we do this. Do they like it? Are they well off? Are they thriving? Those sorts of things, right? And then what we care about is system improvement or persistence, for example, in the sense of well-being or thriving, whatever we might call it. What are we asking about? Well, what system or community do we want to build or keep despite shocks and stresses? And we look for tools, resources, governance mechanisms, coalitions to assess, plan, and implement those actions. It's quite slightly different in focus than the process one. It is highly normative and explicitly normative about what we want. Sometimes it actually says that explicitly, but it's highly value-driven. Now, continuing on this distinctions, if you think again about resilience as system versus process, system trait versus process of outcome, how is it linked to sustainability? Well, in the first instance, we don't know. It may or may not at all support sustainability, right? If you have the degraded, algae-driven lake, not sustainable. So that's not what we're interested in. In this case here, resilience is a requirement to achieve resilience. Sustainability, and in the last case, it gets awfully close to actually equating the two. How is it linked to risk management? Information is an input to risk management. In the second case, it's part or an extension. I'm using these categorization we saw yesterday put up by a number of people. It's part or an extension of risk management, and here it's actually a goal of risk management along a whole bunch of other things we might do to achieve sustainability or resilience in the way this is defined. Interestingly, aspect here about the politics. In the first case, it is supposedly, I would say, apolitical. It just says, you know, we're staying agnostic on whatever. We're not touching politics, really. We might then later get to, you know, pathologies and failures because we didn't include them, but whatever. In this case, it's implicitly political because it is all focused, without questioning it, on sustaining a particular system, right? That flood system, we're going to sustain that in the face of change, in the face of bigger climate change, no matter who's doing anything or how we got to it in the first place and whether that's still a good thing for the rest of the entire community. In this one here, it's an explicitly and inherently political act. I think that's quite important to think about. The challenges it has received in terms of the science is that, you know, lots of people were quite unhappy with the sort of uncritical adoption of ecological theories or even mechanical theories and or transferring them to social sciences. In this case here, I think the biggest criticism is that it's neglected the larger system and doesn't question it. And in this case here, there is a risk of neglecting history, change, cross-scale interactions, social ecological impacts that go beyond the system, and the complexity of the larger system. Those are the biggest challenges in each case. And I believe if we actually addressed some of or took pieces from each other, we could maybe make up, you know, of each other's shortcomings. The last piece I want to say about this is there is progress in each of these. In the first case is that we've gone from thinking about just ecological systems or, you know, physical systems to social, technical, ecological systems, socio-ecological systems, however people have defined it. In this case here, I think the biggest progress we're making is we're going from command and control to being much more adaptive. And in this one here, I think the biggest progress is that we go from isolated, siloed ways of looking at certain outcomes to whole system, whole community approaches. So if that holds any truth, maybe, I don't know, if that holds any truth, I was thinking, well, how does this translate to the definitions of social responsibility? And in fact, what you see out in the literature is a direct adoption of these three approaches and increasingly a blending, I think an uncritical blending, throwing everything into, you know, one definition. You see definitions that focus on the ability to self-organize so as to maintain functioning system properties to withstand or avoid disasters, which very much sort of mirrors the ecological theory. In this case here, it's the ability to cope, absorb, recover, adapt. That was Igor's, or the executive order definition, actually exactly replicated in the definition that the European cases yesterday illustrated. And in this case here, we see definitions that look at ability to thrive, maintain, increase well-being, be safe, sustain livelihoods, you name it, right? Apple pie and motherhood and everything else into the blender. So these are increasingly literally thrown together into one definition, and everything has to be done at once. I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's just for a moment, in our attempt to sort of make conceptual linkages, look at are we seeing people who look at this, or this, or this, are we seeing them talk about adaptation? Yes, increasingly in every case. Are we seeing them talk increasingly about transformation? Yes, in every case. Just one example here. Here, people who talk about transformation want to change the whole system. They want to address the deepest drivers of vulnerability and actually create more equity in the whole community, in the larger system, right? So we're seeing that while other people gladly talk about resilience but want to exactly maintain what they have. The whole thing, the whole package deal, because it serves them. So we're seeing this in both of these in cases. And in terms of indicator development, yes, actually in every case, except that what the indicators are about is different. They really try to get at different aspects. So I've been guilty of doing indicator work myself. And I'll just focus on this one quick slide here. I've been working in a 3-year project, transdisciplinary project involving many, many different disciplinary experts and practitioners from the local, regional, state, federal level, private sector, NGO sectors to co-design a framework for how should we think about adaptation success. And interestingly, what they came up with are 6 dimensions. They want to be, and each one is a sort of a necessary but insufficient condition, if you will. If you do not look at how the process of adaptation is being implemented, you're not getting the story right. If you're not looking at how people are making decisions or whether those decisions are good decisions, you're not getting the story right. If you're not looking at what they're doing, the actual actions they're taking, you're not getting it right. If you're not looking at how that's coming out in the end, you're not getting it right. Each one of them needs particular types of capacities and overcome certain barriers, and if you do not look at that, you're not getting the story right of whether someone is succeeding or not. Now, what's interesting, in a follow-up study James and I are working on with coastal communities, we're looking at, can we identify a handful of indicators that looks at the whole thing? And what we're finding, came to me last night, is that on this end of the spectrum, if you will, people are far more theoretical, agnostic, and kind of positivist in their attempt to think about it, whereas on that side of things, indicators are, you get into normative discussions, deeply normative discussions, and there's no way you can avoid those. There is no one thing, no one outcome indicator that will work for everyone, for every situation, and everyone will be happy. Not possible. So you have to deal with the politics of it in that, even with indicators. Now, I want to come back to the issue of whether we can have it all in terms of throwing, the coping, the adapting, and the transforming all into one thing. The theory would tell us that if you have high resilience, medium resilience, low resilience, what kind of change would you see in the system? When you have high resilience, you will stay within your first basin of attraction, right? Your system state. If you are sort of in the medium range of resilience, you might need to actually adjust so that you can stay within that basin of attraction. And if you have very low resilience, you are at the highest risk of transforming, right? Now keep that in mind when I then say there's a growing attempt out there in the social sciences to say social resilience is all of it. Now that's really tricky. So coping capacities, keeping things the same in the face of disturbance, keeping up with change to basically keep the things as you would like them to be, and make fundamental shift. My question to you is, what's required socially, politically, psychologically, financially, institutionally, human capital, information, whatever, to cope versus to adapt versus to transform? Are they the same things? Are they just sort of gradations of the same? A little bit of this will help you to cope, a little more of that will help you adapt, and a little more of that will help you transform? Or is there maybe actually a fundamental difference? You need different capabilities, to pick up on that word, to do one versus the other. I don't think we have that answer. Are there certain qualities that maybe dominate in different capacities? And are there trade-offs? If you want to build coping capacity, are you fundamentally undermining your transformative capacity? Which gets us then to the question of what in the social sciences ought we to work on to get smarter about theory development. One of the critiques that has come many, many times is that the ecological theories do not properly address human agency. Vision, imagination, anticipation, foresight, leadership, capacity, needs, or building. It also does not adequately address social relations or the collective agency, if you will. This is more focused on the individual, and this more on the collective. Social capital, trust, Roger brought that up, norms, power and privilege. We have not dealt enough with the knowledge systems, how we learn in them, how we integrate diverse systems and collaborate across them. And we don't know really about how we play into that, the issue of institutions, governance, to essentially help bring governance about. And I want to say one quick word here about the possibility of, we brought this up in our conversations yesterday afternoon, you might actually need someone deeply disturbing on an individual level in order for you to maintain the full system, in order to sustain or transform. That will totally, when we talk about sort of the social system that we're trying to maintain, we also always think of this as some homogeneous blob. But maybe within that homogeneous blob, there are key individuals that need to be not part of it and linked in sort of happy-go-lucky, kumbaya kind of ways to each other, but need to be a disturbance to the social system in order to maintain the entire social ecological system. So last thing I want to throw out are then a tip of the iceberg research challenges. I think we have been really remiss in becoming clear what we mean by the social. What is the unit that we're talking about, and what is it that about the social we need to look at? I want to quickly just refer to this one paper that was a review of social science studies, and it was a really sad paper to read, because basically what it says is that mostly we when we study resilience, we look at individuals, not at communities, not at sectors, not at systems. We don't understand them well. We do that mostly right after a disaster happens. We do not do long-term longitudinal or cross-scale studies. We do that mostly through surveys. We've seen a few examples of that this morning. We do not do in-depth case studies. We do not do theory development, causal explanation, whatever. So I think we can do a lot better on this to actually understand how the social systems work. We need to clarify the differences between these capacities, and maybe then really focus on where is the tipping point in the human system before we go on.
Thank you. Comments?
So I think it's very interesting the way you tried to do the matrix, a worthy effort. I think the value of the effort is to look for riffs and things that don't quite fit, rather than go what does fit. And so on the politics one, it has to be there. I think of it as managing goal conflicts, and that there's always goal conflicts. And the question in adaptive systems is, maladaptive systems, those run downhill, and you end up with a lot of working at cross purposes. In successful ones, whether you look at Ostrom's work or Al Roth's work, they're all talking about properties of it as a co-adaptive relationship, vertically or horizontally, that manages the goal conflicts. So that everyone gets enough of their goals satisfied that they'll work, collaboration's too strong a word, but they'll stay aligned. And I don't think the politics one captures that, the generality that you're going for with this matrix, because I think if you centered it more around how you manage goal conflicts, the system process outcome would be, might work a little, might have different things in the cell that would work as well as some of your other columns work. So that's one suggestion.
I think maybe the wedding between the two columns might be the way to go. What I think about here, maybe it's not stated right of what we care about, but it is very much in, what are people actually ultimately about? And so their focus obviously defines very much how many goals do they look at or ignore. And of course, we would be all better off if maybe we integrated that. But I think in terms of the approaches, what is included, what is looked at, is quite different. In each one of those different, varieties of resilience.
Just quickly going back to the comment about managing goal conflict, it's interesting that it doesn't surface the issue about the differential power relationships that are so much a part of being able to stop the discussion in its tracks or move it forward in a particular ram it through a societal process.
I think people who are, working on resilience sort of in the way that I've heard it anyway here. I'm looking at Colorado, I'm looking at Baltimore, a few other places. It's literally, people know this is a political process. It is the weighing of, how do we accommodate these different interests. Anyway.
Yeah, yours.
Susie, I'm not sure exactly why, but your talk made me think of Ben Franklin's tree.
Oh, I'm so glad.
For two reasons. One being the role of the innovative individual on systems. And the second being he was at the cusp of systems that persisted for over 100 years. I'm thinking the library system, the postal system, and one form of a democratic system. So can you kind of reflect on the attributes, or maybe what's in the literature about why those kinds of systems seem to have some resiliency, and the other is the role of those key players, those innovative thinkers?
Well, so I try to bring up at least the role of individuals in these systems, both, I suppose, in some ways you could say as the disturbers that try to change systems, but also in many ways as very strong controlling influences on maintaining certain systems. So I actually don't know enough history to tell you why Ben Franklin had anything to do with the postal system or what his role was in that, if anything. But what we do so change only occurs when someone steps out of the norm, when someone steps out of what is already institutionalized, in formal or informal procedures and norms and institutions that we have. So that's why I think actually having a focus specifically on the disturbers, on the positive deviants, on the whatever you want to, whatever your favorite framework for that is, leadership, literature is huge on this. Everyone, I think it came up about 7 times yesterday about the importance of leadership. I think we need to understand their role a lot better within those systems, but you have to balance that, the source of innovation, if you will, in an individual, with a source of innovation that can come out of the collective. And this is structuration, right? Theory, Giddens, social, the agency, and structures that sort of support and or hinder making changes. So you definitely need to look at, how the social, the relational supports or hinders what an individual might do, and embed that into both the informal into the more and the informal with the more formal institutions we set up in society, to understand where is the tipping point when you can disturb a social system enough to get change. I would say the postal system has served many, many objectives long enough. The military, in many ways, supports many, many, objectives we have long enough that we maintain it. Right? The question is, when can we disturb it enough to shift it or get rid of it or change it replace it with something else?